Maybe you might have been waiting for the rest of Flat Stanley. Oh, honestly, last week I recorded it. I read the whole book, recorded it all, and then only discovered that it wasn't able to upload to the website because it was too long. And I couldn't trim it into 2 bits either. So I'm back to it. If you remember, in the first chapter, go back and listen to it again if you can't. Flat Stanley was squashed in the night with a bulletin board, a big notice board fell on him and squashed him in the night. And his younger brother Arthur discovered him. So now we move on to finding out what life being flat is like for Stanley. When Stanley got used to being flat, he enjoyed it. He could go in and out of rooms even when the door was closed, just by lying down and sliding through the crack at the bottom. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop said it was silly, but they were quite proud of him. Arthur got jealous and he tried to slide under doors too, but he just banged his head. Being flat could also be helpful, Stanley found. He was taking a walk with Mrs. Lambchop one afternoon when her favourite ring fell from her finger. The ring rolled across the pavement and down between the bars of a grating that covered a deep dark shaft. Mrs. Lambchop began to cry. "I've got an idea," Stanley said. He took the laces out of his shoes and an extra pair out of his pocket and tied them all together to make one long lace. Then he tied the end of that to the back of his belt and gave the other end to his mother. "Lower me," he said, "and I'll look for the ring." "Thank you, Stanley," Mrs. Lambchop said. She lowered him between the bars and moved him carefully up and down from side to side so that he could search the whole floor of the shaft. 2 policemen came by and stared at Mrs. Lambchop as she stood holding the long lace that ran down through the grating. She pretended not to notice them. "What's the matter, lady?" the first policeman asked. "Is your yo-yo stuck?" "I am not playing with a yo-yo," Mrs. Lambchop said sharply. "My son is at the other end of this lace, if you must know." "Oh, get the net, Harry," said the second policeman. "We have caught a cuckoo." Just then, down in the shaft, Stanley cried out, "Hooray!" Mrs. Lambchop pulled him up and saw that he had the ring. "Good for you, Stanley," she said, and then she turned angrily to the policeman. "A cuckoo indeed," she said. "Shame on you." The policeman apologised. "We didn't get it, lady," they said. "We've been hasty. We see that now." "People should think twice before making rude remarks," said Mrs. Lambchop, "and then not make them at all." The policeman realised that that was a good rule and they would try to remember it. One day Stanley got a letter from his friend Thomas Anthony Jeffrey, whose family had moved to California. A school holiday was about to begin and Stanley was invited to spend it with the Jeffreys. "Oh, wow," Stanley said. "I'd love to go." Mr. Lambchop sighed. "A round train trip to California is very expensive, or even an aeroplane ticket. I shall have to think of some cheaper way." When Mr. Lambchop came home from the office that evening, he brought with him an enormous brown paper envelope. "I wonder what that was for." "Now then, Stanley," he said, "try this for size." The envelope fitted Stanley very well. There was even room left over, Mrs. Lambchop discovered, for an egg salad sandwich made with thin bread and a flat cigarette case filled with milk. They had to put a great many stamps on the envelope to pay for both airmail and insurance, but it was still much less expensive than a train or an aeroplane ticket to California would have been. The next day, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop slid Stanley into his envelope, along with the egg salad sandwich and the milk, and mailed him from the box on the corner. The envelope had to be folded to fit through the slot, but Stanley was a limber boy, and inside the box he just straightened up again. Mrs. Lambchop was nervous because Stanley had never been away from home before. She rapped on the box. "Can you hear me, dear?" she called. "Are you all right?" Stanley's voice came quite clearly. "I'm fine. Can I eat my sandwich now?" "Wait an hour," said Mrs. Lambchop, "and try not to get overheated." Then she and Mr. Lambchop cried out, "Goodbye, goodbye," and went home. Stanley had a fine time in California. When the visit was over, the Jeffreys returned him in a beautiful white envelope they had made themselves. It had red and blue markings on it to show that it was airmail, and Thomas Jeffrey had lettered it valuable and fragile, this end up on both sides. Back home, Stanley told his family that he had been handled so carefully he never felt a single bump. Mr. Lamb Chop said it proved that jet planes were wonderful, and so was the post office department, and that this was a great age in which to live. Stanley thought so too. Next chapter is called Stanley the Kite. Mr. Lamb Chop had always liked to take the boys off with him on Sunday afternoons to a museum or roller skating in the park, but it was difficult when they were crossing streets or moving about in crowds. Stanley and Arthur would often be jostled from his side, and Mr. Lamb Chop worried about speeding taxis or that hurrying people might accidentally knock them down. It was easier after Stanley got flat. Mr. Lamb Chop discovered that he could roll Stanley up without hurting him at all. He would tie a piece of string round Stanley to keep him from unrolling and make a little loop in the string for himself. It was as simple as carrying a parcel, and he could hold on to Arthur with the other hand. You see it? Stanley did not mind being carried because he had never much liked to walk anyway. Arthur didn't like walking either, but he had to. It made him mad. One Sunday afternoon in the street, they met an old college friend of Mr. Lamb Chop's, a man he had not seen for years. "Well, George, I see you have bought some wallpaper," the man said. "Going to decorate your house, I suppose?" "Wallpaper?" said Mr. Lamb Chop. "No, this is my son Stanley." He undid the string and Stanley unrolled. "How do you do?" Stanley said. "Nice to meet you, young fella," the man said. He said to Mr. Lamb Chop, "George, that boy is flat." "Yep, smart too," Mr. Lamb Chop said. "Stanley is third from the top in his class at school." "Phew," said Arthur. "Oh, this is my younger son, Arthur," Mr. Lamb Chop said, "and he will apologise for his rudeness." Arthur could only blush and apologise. Mr. Lamb Chop rolled Stanley up again, and they set off back for home. It rained quite hard while they were on the way. Stanley, of course, hardly got wet at all, just around the edges, but Arthur got soaked. Late that night, Mr. and Mrs. Lamb Chop heard a noise out in the living room. They found Arthur lying on the floor near the bookcase. He had piled a great many volumes of the Encyclopaedia Britannica on top of himself. "Put some more on me," Arthur said when he saw them. "Don't just stand there, help me." Mr. and Mrs. Lamb Chop sent him back to bed, but the next morning they spoke to Stanley. "Arthur can't help being jealous. Be nice to him, you're his big brother after all." Stanley and Arthur were in the park. The day was sunny but windy too, and many older boys were flying beautiful, enormous kites with long tails, made in all the colours of the rainbow. Arthur sighed. "Some day," he said, "I will have a big kite, and I'll win a kite flying contest and be famous like everybody else. Nobody knows who I am these days." Stanley remembered what his parents had said. He went to a boy whose kite was broken and borrowed a large spool of string. "You can fly me, Arthur," he said. "Come on." He attached the string to himself and gave Arthur the spool to hold. He ran lightly across the grass, sideways to get up speed, and then he turned to meet the breeze. Up, 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 up went Stanley, being a kite. He knew just how to manage on the gusts of wind. He faced full into the wind if he wanted to rise, and let it take him from behind when he wanted speed. He had only to turn his thin edge to the wind, carefully, a little at a time, so that it did not hold him. And then he would slip gracefully down towards the earth again. Arthur let out all the string, and Stanley soared high above the trees, a beautiful sight in his pale sweater and bright brown trousers against the blue sky. Everyone in the park stood still to watch. Stanley swooped right, then left in long matched swoops. He held his arms by his side and zoomed at the ground like a rocket and curved up again towards the sun. He side-slipped and circled and made figure of eights and crosses and a star. Nobody has ever flown the way Stanley Lambchop flew that day, and probably no one will ever do so again. After a while, of course, people grew tired of watching Arthur and got tired of running about with the empty spool. Sorry, I'll read that bit again. After a while, of course, people grew tired of watching, and Arthur got tired of running about with the empty spool. Stanley went right on, though, showing off. 3 boys came up to Arthur and invited him to join them for a hot dog and some soda. Arthur left the spool wedged in the fork of a tree. He didn't notice while he was eating his hot dog that the wind was blowing the string and tangling it about the tree. The string got shorter and shorter, but Stanley didn't realize how low he was until leaves brushed his feet, and then it was too late. He got stuck in the branches. 15 minutes passed before Arthur and the other boys heard his cries and climbed up to set him free. Stanley would not speak to his brother that evening, and at bedtime, even though Arthur had apologized, he was still cross. Alone with Mr. Lambchop in the living room, Mrs. Lambchop sighed and shook her head. "You're at the office all day having fun," she said. "You don't realize what I go through with the boys. They're very difficult." "Oh, kids are like that," Mr. Lambchop said. "Phases. Be patient, dear." Okay, I'll leave this one here and then I'll do another little video for the next chapter. See you soon.